us, Lord, and heal our land, and give us eyes to see the light and hearts to understand that through your love all things are new, and the blessings of the land we love all have come from you. If the people would only see the light that lives within us all is all we really need. God will hear us and move our hands, and freely then will we live, and we can heal our land.
So I invite you to close your eyes or create a soft focus upon the flame of the candle. Just allow yourself to settle into your chair and imagine that that chair is the arms of spirit supporting and holding you. We just allow ourselves to leave whatever has taken place before this moment, just to leave it behind, and we can always pick it up later. Just allow ourselves to be here, fully present, right here and now. The best way for us to get centered and be in resonance together is with our breath. And so I invite you to take a deep, deep breath in to the center of your being, and hold and release the breath fully. And again, a deep breath in, knowing that that is the in-breath, the inspiration of spirit, and breathe out, the out-breath of spirit. Know that each time we breathe in the very experience of Father, Mother, God, Spirit, and each time we exhale, we breathe out our own individualized expression of the One. And while we express ourselves in a multitude of diversity, we remain one in the unity of all life and creation. And so we allow ourselves to remember the truth of our being, that each one of us is an expression of the divine, that each of us individually and all of us collectively are spirit expressing. And for this remembrance of the truth and our willingness to live in, through, and as that truth in all that we are, all that we think, say, and do, I am eternally grateful. And so it is. And together we say, thank God within and all around us. Amen.
And freely then will we live, and we will heal our land.
Good evening. I'm Reverend Dr. Susie Shadle. I welcome you to Unity of Sarasota, where something wonderful is always happening, and tonight we are in for a very special treat. I want to just say a little bit about what has brought this evening to come to pass. I was invited by Reverend Barbara Williams, who's visiting us this evening. Welcome, Reverend Barbara. I was invited by Reverend Barbara to speak and present up at Chautauqua this summer. And in the midst of that, I met Karen Tibbals, and we had some really wonderful conversations, and then I read her book, and I was very impressed. And for the last year and a half or so, we have been talking in this spiritual community about the idea that one of our central tenets is that we are all one. And sometimes when we're deep in the midst of our human experience, it's a bridge too far to think, oh yeah, we're all one with that guy, are you kidding me? So I started talking about, well, maybe a first step is to find common ground. And then together we can build on that common ground to arrive at that place of really embracing and embodying our oneness. And so when I read Karen's book, I thought, wow, this is right on point with that. And she's developed some models and some tools that I think are very powerful for us to have some constructive and very productive conversations, even with people we disagree with, and maybe most especially with people that we disagree with, so that we can begin to understand one another and build by using creative conflict to come to new conclusions and new ways of being. So the one way, the opposite way, and creating a third way that we can all agree upon and heal our land. Thank you for that song, Lisa Arundale. So I'm going to bring Karen up and let her guide us through the processes and the tools that she has for us. And she has graciously sent me workshop materials so that we can do what we've been talking about for a while and create some dialogue groups where we can practice using some of her tools. So please join me in welcoming Karen Tibbals. I'm going to go back and run the slides, and let's welcome her to Unity of Sarasota.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I don't know if Reverend Susie told you, but my son is getting married about an hour and a half away from here on Saturday. So it's wonderful for me to be able to combine the opportunity to talk to you as well as see my son get married. And I brought my husband along. And I'm a Quaker, and I have a degree, master's degree in religion. And what I found when I went to seminary was what I'm going to share with you today. But I've taken it further, I think, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So thank you very much for having me here tonight. Tonight I'm going to give you an introduction to a spiritual practice that I've been developing, the work that resulted in my latest book, Persuade, Don't Preach, and the work that I've been doing since then, because there's more of it. As Susie said, there's a discussion guide, but there's more I'll tell you about later. So, next slide. As we all know, our country is divided. These divisions are not going away. And they're affecting not just our politics. Next slide. They're affecting our families, our neighborhoods, and our relationships. Next slide. It happened to me a few years ago. I was visiting with my Aunt Dot, who was the last living member of my birth family. She was my childless aunt, the aunt who was there my entire childhood. Next slide. It wasn't a holiday without my aunt taking pictures. Next slide. There's me on the left. Towards the end of her life, next slide. Towards the end of her life, she couldn't live, next slide. Towards the end of her life, she couldn't live alone any longer. She was pretty old. So she had an immigrant caregiver, Jeannie, who was always there. She was always there, nearby. And at this last visit, her caregiver was sitting on the opposite side of the living room, and Aunt Dot started venting to me about something she had read in a newspaper somewhere about immigration. Now, her caregiver was an immigrant. I lost it. I just totally lost it. I told her she was being rude, and I walked out. That was the last time I saw her. She died about a year later. I wish I had known then what I know now. I wish I'd had some different tools. Let me share with you tonight some of the tools I've learned since then, ones I think that would have helped us continue the conversation so that I wouldn't have walked out. Next slide. I'm going to start with what Jesus says about loving your enemies in Matthew 5:44. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I certainly didn't do that with my aunt, and she's not my enemy. How can Jesus ask us to do that? As I present this, I want you to keep that thought in your mind and consider how to use this information to help you love your enemies and even love your neighbor, even if you don't particularly like them. For me, I've come to believe that what Jesus was talking about is that we need a spiritual solution, that the only way we can come to that sort of love is with a spiritual solution. And that's what this journey is about. Next slide. My start on this journey was a book that I read while I was in seminary. It's not a religious book, not a spiritual book. It's a social psychology book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And I read it as part of doing my thesis that I wrote. But one of the key points I took away, next slide, was that I consider this a spiritual concept, that we need to separate the person that we're looking at and talking to from the position they hold on the issues and from the values that they hold. And those values are what lead them to take those positions on the issues. But if we recognize that there's three separate parts to this, then we can start to get some distance. Now, those values that I'm talking about, they're invisible. We don't see them. We don't pay attention to them. We fight wars over them, but we never talk about them. But this book helped me start to see those values in my own life and in the lives of others. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through the basics of moral foundation theory, which I call something different in my book, but I'll stay with moral foundation theory for tonight. And it's based on that book, his book, and other research that I've read. I've done a lot of reading about moral foundation theory. And I'm going to share with you about the values and what the way that it varies for people, and so we can start to understand people in a different way. So next slide. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to take you through a series of montages of pictures. So each montage represents one of those values. And here's some pictures. So I want you to call out what words come to mind when you see these pictures. Say it again. Games. Team. Together. Anybody else?
Peace and conflict.
I didn't hear the first part. I heard conflict. Peace and conflict. Okay. Next slide. I'm going to use the words belonging and community to refer to this moral foundation. It's not the words that Jonathan Haidt uses in his book. He calls it loyalty to the group. But being a Quaker, community is very important to us. And so I'm going to talk about community in this. Next slide. Here's the second set of pictures. What words come to mind when you see these pictures? Law and order? Authority. Okay, next slide. I'm going to use the word authority or respect for authority. Next slide. What words come to mind here? Faith? Peace? Spirituality. Next slide. I'm going to use the words sacredness and purity. The next one. Next slide. What words come to mind for this one? Balance, fairness. That's the word. Next slide, fairness. Now move on to the next slide. This is the last one for this. What words come to mind when you see these pictures? Love, caring, caregiver. Next slide. I'm going to use the words care for others. So next slide. So these are the 5 with my words that Haidt has identified as moral foundations: belonging, community, respect for authority, sacredness, purity, fairness, and care for others. Now, the thing about this is that we all have them. We all have the same 5. There might be some other ones. We can talk about that another time. But we all have these same 5s. And, there's a lot of people who've done cross-cultural studies. They've identified them across all sorts of different cultures. So we all have this in common. But, next slide. They look different, and we give a different importance to them. And that's the source of our conflict. Next slide. Let me take you through some of the differences to give you a short primer in this. It's a very educational evening you're having. When you do a study and you ask people the questions that kind of sort out how important things are, what you find is that people who self-identify as liberals tend to put much more importance, I mean much more importance, like off the charts more importance, on the bottom two on that list, fairness and care for others. Now, not everybody fits this pattern, and I don't fit the pattern myself, so if you don't feel like you don't fit, that's fine, but most people fit this pattern. Next slide. Conservatives, on the other hand, tend to be about even across all 5 of them. Interesting, huh? Next slide. So what that means is that conservatives are higher in belonging because liberals are so low. Next slide. And not only are they just so low, they have a different form of belonging when they have a form of belonging. And they're much more, consider themselves much more global citizens. And for conservatives, it's much more tied to a place. So they're much more nationalistic, they're much more patriotic. That's the source of one of the major differences. Next slide. Conservatives are higher in respect for authority, but it also depends on which authority, doesn't it? Next slide. Conservatives are also higher in sacredness and purity, but again, we have different interpretations. So here I've rearranged the pictures to put the pictures that are much more typically Christian on the right side of the slide, and the pictures that are more esoterically pure on the left side. Now there's obviously variations, but generalizations, it's basically true. Next slide. Now, this is the really tricky slide to talk about. The thing about sacredness is that it goes down so deep. And if you violate somebody's sense of what is sacred, the way you know that is they get a feeling of disgust. Now, disgust is actually tied to a feeling of nausea. So this is physiological. Darwin described the disgust face. There's a specific face people make when they feel disgusted. Their nose flares and their upper lip curls, and it's called the Disgust Gape, as described by Charles Darwin. So this has been around for a long time. And we get these feelings of disgust when our sense of order, when our sense of what's right is violated. And sometimes that's for pictures of people who don't fit our image of way people should look, like if they have a big belly, or if they're bleeding, or if they're of another race. So you can't just teach somebody about anti-racism and expect them to change their mind because they're feeling disgusted and they don't even realize it. They don't realize it. Glad I'm done this slide. Next slide, please. Fairness. We all have a sense of fairness. I said liberals are much higher, but we have different, what I'll call flavors of fairness. So the balance beam that I put on the left, 2 stones, approximately the even size, different colors, it's balanced. It represents equality pretty well, I think. The balance beam on the right, however, how could that be balanced? Why is that balanced like that? I'm using that to represent the idea of a merit-based form of fairness, where you give some people more weight, and so it ends up being balanced even though there's fewer people, or whatever it is. And you might think about this in terms of, say, college admissions, promotions at work. We use merit-based fairness a lot. But we tend to each favor one particular flavor of fairness and not think about the other, even though we use all of them all the time. But I'm just asking you to be aware of these different flavors of fairness. And I talk about them more in the book, and there's questions in the workshop guide that I gave to Reverend Susie. And then next one. And caring, we all have, we all care for people, and we all have this, but because conservatives have the other foundations also that are so high, they mediate with each other and they interfere, and so they care more for certain people because of the other factors. Next slide. So that's what makes people so unpredictable and complicated. If you've got a moral foundation that's reinforcing a cause or an issue, if you've got more than one, if you've got 2 or 3, that's going to make it really strong. But if they conflict, you never know which way it's going to turn out. And I thought I was pretty much an expert on this, and I've been surprised. Sometimes I'm right on, and sometimes I'm just really surprised. Next slide. And as I said before, these go so deep. The feeling of disgust, it actually uses different parts of your brain for the different moral foundations. The amygdala is involved in the caring. It's also involved in fear. The insula, which is involved in disgust, is involved. It affects saliva production, it affects sweat production, it affects testosterone production, it affects oxytocin production. It's no wonder we can't talk to people when their brains are operating differently than ours are. So, next slide. Next slide, we'll skip that one. Okay, so let's go back to the encounter with my aunt. I see now that we were both talking about immigration. Well, I wasn't. I said she was rude, so I didn't even talk about immigration. But we were using different values. The way I think about it now is when she was talking about immigration, she was probably referencing the value of belonging and community. Me, on the other hand, I was upset because of what was important to me was the value of care for others, care for Jeannie, who was sitting in the room. So now I'm going to quiz you. Let's see how well you've learned what I've been teaching. Next slide. I've created some statements about immigration that all use the moral foundations. So here's statement 1. Keeping people from other countries out of the U.S. harms potential immigrants. What one moral foundation is really hit on most strongly in this statement? Who wants to volunteer? Care for others. Right, harms, absolutely. Number 2. Keeping people from other countries out of the U.S. isn't fair because they didn't ask to be born where they're born. What? Fairness, yes. Number 3, keeping people from other countries out of the U.S. is necessary because we need to ensure that we have enough for the people who already live here. What moral foundation? I'm sorry. Belonging, absolutely. Number 4, keeping people from other countries out of the U.S. is necessary because we have to protect our country from being infested with people like that. It's not authority, sacredness. Infestation, talking about people as if they're not human, is part of sacredness. Keeping illegal immigrants out of the U.S. is important because we need to follow the law. That's authority. So we have all 5 different moral foundations represented in one issue. The words we choose are insight into what is going on, what values we're talking about. Next slide. So that's part 1 of what I'm going to talk to you about. And that's the spiritual practice of seeing other people's values. And hopefully now you'll be a little bit better at doing that. I mean, it's a journey to do this, and I've been improving as I've been working on this for the past 5 years or so. But I don't want to stop there. There is more, I think. Because if we can learn to use another person's values in our conversations are going to be more productive. And I'll tell you more about that right now. But first I'll tell you an Aesop fable on the next slide. I'm going to use an Aesop fable to illustrate it. So the way the Aesop fable goes is the sun and the wind decided to have a contest to see which one was the most powerful. And the way they were going to determine who was the winner was who could get the traveler to take off their cloak. Next slide. So the wind goes first and blows as hard as it could. And what does the traveler do? Holds on as tight as it can. Wind didn't win. Next slide. The sun came out and shone as brightly as it could. And the traveler sat down, took off its cloak to sit on the cloak, and basked in the sun. And that's what it's like when we can talk to people in the language of what they understand. If we can talk to them in their own values, we can get them to relax and listen. Next slide. That's what I call persuade, don't preach. Next slide. But this isn't, next slide. But this isn't just an Aesop fable or my idea. There's actually some academic researchers who've done this and who prove that it works. They're the names of Rob Willer and Matt Feinberg. Willer's at Stanford, Feinberg's at the University of Toronto. And their initial 5 studies they did on five issues, 2 conservative issues, support for an army, support for English as a required language, and the 3 liberal issues, universal health care, environmental issues, and same-sex marriage. And in all 5 studies, they showed that if you use a value, like I explained on immigration, you could use a lot of the different values to support. There's a lot of ways to create an argument. If you use one of the values that's important to the person you're talking about, they showed that you can switch, not everybody, but at least some people, to change their minds. It was so strong that for the environmental issue, they used the sacredness purity, and they didn't talk at all about climate change. Not once did they talk about climate change. But afterwards, the attitudes about climate change changed, even though they didn't talk about it. That's how powerful it is. Next slide. And it's not just an academic issue. It's not just something they showed in research. I'm going to read this quote from Jacinda Ardern, who's the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And she said this quote right after the Christchurch shooting. If you remember, what happened was there was an Australian man who flew over to New Zealand to buy his guns, and he shot, I forget how many, 50-some Muslims. He went to two mosques, and he was on his way to the third when he was caught. And now New Zealand, the reason why he could buy his guns in New Zealand is just like the US, New Zealand had no gun control laws. Why? New Zealand's a conservative country, very conservative. Sheep farmers, they need their guns. They need their guns. But they had no gun control laws. This is what Jacinda said 2 weeks after the shooting. They, the victims, are us. The person who has perpetrated this violence against us is not. They have no place in New Zealand. Now, before I went through this education myself about moral foundation theory, I might have said, oh, that was the Care and Belonging Foundation, or maybe it was the Care Foundation. I wouldn't have seen the belonging in that, but it's very strongly belonging, being part of us, being part of the country. This statement was so successful that 2 weeks later, the New Zealand legislature passed their first ever gun control legislation. Their first ever gun control legislation. That's how powerful this technique is. Next slide. Here's another example. This is the environmental issues. This is Pew data research. You can see over time, from starting in 94 to 2016, attitudes about environmental protection have changed among Republicans. It has not changed very much by Democrats. What's going on in this period? 2 things. One thing that's happening is Republicans, or rather the oil and gas industry, instituted a campaign in the mid-aughts in response to the message changing for environmental issues. Before the mid-aughts, the message was, the earth is sacred. We need to protect it. But climate change became the focus in the mid-aughts. And so it went away from the purity and sanctity moral foundation to one of climate change, and we need to care about the people who are going to be harmed by climate change. So it moved from a sacredness purity to a care for others, moved from a conservative value to a liberal value, and you lost support among Republicans. And Willer and Feinberg showed all you need to do is go back and you'll get it back. But we're not. We're just talking about climate change. That's all we're talking about. So that's on us. That's on the next one. This is a fun one. This is an example from Texas. Texas is a 30-some-year-old campaign. Texas had a major problem some 30 years ago. with littering, the Texas Department of Transportation decided to create a campaign. They came up with the idea of a campaign that said, "Don't mess with Texans." Texas. Very belonging campaign, and a little bit of authority because it's got this scolding kind of tone to it. Fits really well with people who are from Texas. Very, very successful campaign's been running for over 30 years. And the roads are cleaner. They are cleaner. This stuff works. I have other examples, but I think you get the idea. This stuff works in real life. It works in psychologists' research labs. It works all the time. If we can learn to talk to each other, we can get people to listen. So next slide. But we need to have conversations. So how do we make this part of the conversation? And now I'm going outside the book. Because I wrote the book that basically concludes what's in the book. And the book doesn't have the spiritual dimension to it. I saved that for congregations like you. But we need to work it into a conversation. We can't just spout this stuff off. We need to be neighbors. So I found this model that I've been working with from one of the presentations I gave to another church, and somebody told me about this woman who had created this model. And this is being used in other locations. It's being used in diversity programs. There's a lot of applications. But there's basically 4 steps: asking questions, listening, affirming. How often do we never say something we agree with or something we like? And then finally responding and doing this reframing that I'm talking to, but putting it in the context. And I've been writing about this in a newsletter that I write about every week. And I'll put the address, I'll put the information up in a few minutes. Next slide. So, let's go back to my Aunt Dawn. What could I have done? Well, I don't think I would have lost the relationship if I'd asked her some questions. I'd asked her why she is so concerned about immigration. And I could listen with new ears for what the value was that she was talking about. And I could have remembered that we all share those same values and agreed with her on that. It is important that we have a strong country. We may disagree about how to do it, but it's important that we have a strong country. And then I could have reframed it by using a different value. For instance, I might have used the merit-based form of fairness, not the one that I would use instinctively myself, but I think it would have been important to her. If I had stressed, how hard Jeannie worked to keep her fed and cleaned and enable her to live independently. Maybe then I could have said, what do you think, should immigrants like Jeannie be allowed in this country? Now, that might not have been the argument that you or I would do normally, but I think if I had done that and I'd used a value that was important to her, I probably could have gotten her to listen. And I hope that this tool would enable us to find common ground and continue our relationship. And I wouldn't have lost that last year. Next slide. So I hope you can start to see that the values that are underneath the positions you hold and the values that are underneath the positions of those you disagree with are important. And that we can honor those values as expressions of that of God in each other. Seeing that is a spiritual practice. Next slide. Next steps. I'm going to suggest a book study group like Reverend Susie talked about with the discussion guide I created. And sign up for my newsletter, which I'll send the link to Susie. You don't have to take this down now, to take it to the next level. And I am working on a new book, more about these ideas. So, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So, what did I hear?
That was great.
That was great. Can you see how? Sometimes it's important to listen to another's point of view before we rush to get our own point of view across. And can you see how we might possibly find some common ground when we look at what values are driving us, and to find that in many cases the common ground are the values themselves. And just as we say that there are many paths up the spiritual mountain, there are many paths to each of these values, and they're all valuable. And so I appreciate you sharing with us your research and some of the conclusions you've come to, and I look forward to starting some dialogue groups with the materials that you've left with me. I think that if we can practice here, amazingly enough, we talk about being a spiritual community of like mind. It does not mean that we have the exact same mind. I've learned that over the years. And disagreement is not necessarily a bad thing, and conflict isn't either. It's all in the way that we approach it. Conflict can be powerfully creative, as long as we do it with consideration and consciousness. And so I'm hoping that we can be a community that practices that here, and that we can take that everywhere we go, and that we can be the model, the tip of the spear, if you will, for how we can interact with one another in constructive and powerful ways. I think it's absolutely possible, and I don't plan on leaving the planet until we make it happen. So you're stuck with me for that long. So the quicker you go, the quicker I get to, rest. I don't know. So again, thank you, Karen, for coming. I'm so glad that this worked out. It was sort of a God thing. She's down here actually for her son's wedding, and so we decided to capitalize on that and have her come here. So thank you again for that, and thank you, Lisa, for your music. I do want to say that we have a little reception in the bookstore. We've got a little bit of snacks to nosh on. It's not just candy this week because Halloween's over, and we've eaten most of the candy, myself included. But we have actually some healthier food for you back there in the bookstore, and I think a little something to drink, and an opportunity to do some question and answers with Karen, and some book signing if you'd like to get her book. I thought the book was really great. I learned a lot from it, and I was very excited about it. So at the end of the service, please join us in the bookstore, and we have other fun things going on in there as well. So Lisa, will you come up and strum behind me? Oh yeah, I got it. Sorry, changing mics now. What I will say also is that we would most appreciate any gift that you feel moved to give us. We have an offering basket at the back on the pedestal. We're not passing the basket these days because we're following protocols to be safe and healthy with one another. And so if you have a gift that you'd like to leave, please leave it in the basket. We absolutely appreciate anything that you leave there for us, and we will put it to very good use, I promise you. And so let's close with prayer, and then we will depart to the bookstore. So once again, close your eyes if that feels comfortable for you. And allow your attention to move to the very center of your being, that place where Father, Mother, God, Spirit resides within you and also all around you. Knowing that that very same Spirit resides within all of us, no matter what our thoughts, no matter what our beliefs, no matter what ideology, no matter whether we're conservative or liberal or anything in between, that truly we are one. In the very living Spirit, we are one. And in our human experience, we take that step onto common ground. And from that place of common ground, we build a foundation upon which we build that ladder to oneness, so that we fully embrace and embody that we are interconnected, that what we do for another, we also do for ourselves, and what we do to another, we do to ourselves. And so we stand on that common ground, and we reach to that place of oneness and unity, and we heal our land, We make this world a better place. We leave it better than we found it. We create a world that works for all. I'm going to invite Lisa to play another song called Love, Serve, and Remember. Because when we dig deep to the very center of our being and find that place of love within us, we know that we are called to serve one another because of that interconnectedness of love. And all of that helps us to remember who we truly are, that each one of us is an expression of the divine. Each one, all one, the one. It is us. And for this remembrance of the truth and our willingness to live that truth, I am eternally grateful. And so it is, and together we say, thank God within and all around us. Amen.
Why have you come to earth? Do you remember? And why have you taken birth? Why have you come? You've come to love, serve, and remember. To love, to serve, and remember. Remember love. Oh, blessings on your journey, blessings on your way back home. Blessings on your journey, blessings on your way back home. Just carry the light within you. Carry that light within you. Blessings on your journey, blessings on your journey. Oh.
To the bookstore. Follow me.